This week, the Georgia Senate passed a sweeping election bill that would restrict voter access. The Republican-led measure aims to limit early and absentee ballots, which were a major source of Democratic votes in the 2020 election and the 2021 Georgia runoffs. Democrats there claim the measure is in response to the record turnout their party saw. The bill now heads to the State House, where it is expected to pass. And Georgia isn't alone. Also this week, Iowa's Republican Governor Kim Reynolds signed a law that restricts the state's early and election day voting. It's estimated more than 250 similar bills have been introduced in at least 40 states so far this year. For more, let's bring in Michael McDonald. He is a professor of political science at the University of Florida, where he specializes in American elections. Professor McDonald, it's good to have you. Republican supporters say these changes to voting laws will protect election integrity. What do you make of that argument?
Well, it's not just Democratic politicians and election officials who have said that this was one of the most least or fraudulent or most integrity election in history of the United States. Republican secretaries of state, Republican election officials across the country, even former Attorney General Bill Barr has said that there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud in the last election. So the allegation that this last election was somehow fraudulent or lacking integrity just doesn't hold water. There's very little evidence. There's 2 cases of vote fraud in Pennsylvania. You know, there's going to be fraud whenever you have 160 million people do something. You're going to have some isolated incidents of fraud. But there's nothing widespread that happened in this prior election.
Are these tactics constitutional?
Well, in terms of the laws themselves, the states get to decide how they will run their laws. That's in our Constitution. And then the federal government can also pass laws that will regulate federal elections and also uphold voting rights for both federal and state and local elections. So we're going to see over the next month or so a tug of war that's happening as states like Georgia, Arizona, Alabama, Florida, and others move to enact more restrictive voting laws. And at the same time, the federal government has to wrestle with whether or not the U.S. Senate will allow deliberation and voting on a pair of very wide-sweeping reform bills that would basically undo many of the changes that these states are doing at the state level.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about the Democratic response, because Democrats in Washington are trying to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act. Tell our viewers a little bit more about what these measures seek to do.
Yes, there are a pair of measures here. So one, let's start off with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Back in 2013, the Supreme Court had a decision, it's called Shelby County, where they undid a very important part of the Voting Rights Act called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Under Section 5, states and localities that have had some sort of past discrimination have to show that a change to their election law is not discriminatory. And that's a very broad sweeping. It could even be the changing of a polling location. It's really the onus is upon the government, state government or local government, to show that that change is not discriminatory. Well, the Supreme Court back in 2013 said, well, sorry, we don't think that this states that you say need to be covered, there's not a good rationale for that to be happening anymore. You need to come up with a better targeted formula. And so they scrapped that formula to say which states should be covered under this requirement that the federal government or state governments show any changes were non-discriminatory. And so we had no new formula. There's been no states that have been covered since then, since 2013. What the federal government's trying to do here is cover, again, the states that were struck down back in 2013. And that would first stop changes to election laws at the state and local level that were deemed discriminatory. But what would happen right now is that many of these laws are getting passed now. They would not be subject to this preclearance provision. And so they would be enacted. They would not have to go through this review by the federal government. So they would be in effect. So the other thing that you would need, it would only put a stop on any future laws that were discriminatory. So what you have to do is also for the federal government, at least the Democrats, to pass some laws that would cover broadly the way in which federal elections are regulated within the country. Now, if the federal government can do that under Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution. They have that authority. And usually when the federal government does this sort of activity, states will follow suit. They will adopt for their state and local elections the same sort of laws that are present at federal elections. So we would likely see then, if the federal government were to enact H.R. 1 or the sort of things like early voting requirements, no excuse absentee voting, and many other reform efforts that the Democrats would like to have that are currently happening in many states, but they would cover the entire nation with those laws for federal elections and would likely for many state elections.
But Professor McDonald, how might the filibuster actually prevent these measures from being passed?
Well, right now, this law, if it were to, or bill that would come up for debate in the Senate, would be subject to a filibuster. And so you need to get at least 10 Republicans on board with the bill. And that seems highly unlikely. We just saw this COVID relief bill go through without a single Republican senator. So, something that would, bill that would change the way in which elections are run in the country seems like it would be very, very difficult to get even, maybe even a single Republican to sign on to it. So instead, what the Democrats are trying to do is they're looking for some sort of filibuster reform. And Joe Manchin, who's sort of the big key player here, has opened the door to say that he's willing to entertain some sort of filibuster reform to get voting rights legislation passed in the Congress.
It's been interesting tracking what Senator Manchin has to say about filibuster reform. He said he is not in favor of full repeal, but has sort of, as you say, opened the door to some level of reform. Final question for you, Professor. In addition to the more than 250 bills that restrict voting access, the Brennan Center for Justice also tracked more than 700 bill proposals with provisions that would expand voting access. Do you think that this is a good sign for our country, for voter access in general?
It's in our Constitution, really, that we're governed by the people. And the will of the people has to be expressed through elections. And so it's not a good situation when democracy is limiting the voting of certain groups by enacting laws that seem to be targeting a racial group or one political party. And some of these laws that are being entertained at the moment seem to be very narrowly targeted. Say, like in Georgia, doing away with Sunday in-person early voting. Well, that's a day that African-American churches use to do voter mobilization efforts. And so that law seems to be very narrowly targeted at African-Americans' ability to vote. And so that's not good. Needless to say, you need to have a fair playing field. Our election should be decided as a battle of ideas, not restricting the playing field to allow one party or one team to have a winning advantage just by setting up the rules in their favor.
All right, Michael McDonald, thank you.
Good to be with you.